Hi everyone, welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain. For those watching on video, I have changed my background to something agricultural because we are going to be doing some pshat and drash, some plain meaning of the Torah, um, versus the way that Chazal, the way that the rabbis understand it, and it relates specifically to the beginning of sefirat ha-omer. The Torah tells us in Vayikra Perek Kaf Gimel that sefirat ha-omer begins ממחרת השבת, the day after Shabbat. The Baitusim explain that as Sunday, meaning the day after Shabbat, the way we might understand it in a pshat way. However, Chazal understood the day after Shabbat to mean the 16th of Nisan. 16th of Nisan is the day after the first Yom Tov of Pesach. So what I want to do in this shiur, because we're learning Masechet Menachot, and of course both the Korban Omer that is given on ממחרת השבת, 16th of Nisan, and the shtei halechem, the two loaves that are given ממחרת השבת השביעית, meaning the day after the 49-day counting, i.e. on Shavuot, they are both korbanot mincha. They're both mincha offerings, and so our Gemara is interested in understanding ממחרת השבת and why it means the 16th of Nisan. Now, I think there have been many people throughout the years, trying to figure out how you can reconcile the meaning of ממחרת השבת as pshat and as drash, meaning a suggestion that no, actually, even according to the pshat, ממחרת השבת must mean the day after the first Yom Tov of Pesach. And I think in doing that, they've revealed very interesting things about both Pesach and Shavuot. And so I want to learn those things now, not only to understand how people try to mind the gap or narrow the gap between Chazal's understanding of ממחרת השבת and what you might have thought based on just reading the psukim themselves, but I want to see those interesting things that they're telling us about Pesach and Shavuot. So here goes. Let's share my screen. Seems not to matter how many years I do this for. I still am not natural at it. What can you do? So let's take a look. Here we are. So I gave you the pasuk from Vayikra Kaf Gimel that gives us ממחרת השבת. Very nice, beautiful, fabulous. And I give you just one statement from Menachot Samachay Bet 65b that suggests how you would know that actually ממחרת השבת means the day after the first day of Yom Tov. So of Pesach, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Eino Tzarech. You don't need the previous explanation. There's already an explanation that was offered to explain how we would know that ממחרת השבת does not mean Sunday, but actually means the second day of Pesach. Arehu Omer, well, if you look in Devarim, the way the description of counting the Omer is expressed is tispor lach, in the singular. You shall count for yourselves. And Rabbi Eliezer suggests that means sefirat tluya bebeitin, that it's actually talking to the beitin. It's talking to the courts. Shehem yodin lechadesh, because they are the ones who basically determine when the new moon comes. And therefore, ממחרת השבת, the day after Shabbat, must mean macharat Yom Tov, the day after Yom Tov, meaning the first Yom Tov of Pesach. Yatzat Shabbat Breshit, and that excludes the idea that it would be the day after a Saturday. Why? Shesfirata b'chol adam, because every person counts weeks. But who are the people who count Yom Tovs? Beitin, because they're the ones that determine when Rosh Chodesh is, and when they determine when Rosh Chodesh is, they're then determining the holidays. So once the count is in their hands, it must be that the count does not start from the day after Shabbat, which is something anybody knows and figures out. It must start from the day after something that Beitin specifically figures out, namely the day that Pesach should begin based on when Rosh Chodesh Nisan was, something that the Beitin decides based on accepting witnesses of the new moon. So that's one of many interpretations that's offered in the Gemara Menachot to try to explain to you, no, pshat of ממחרת השבת actually means the day after the first Yom Tov of Pesach rather than the day after Sunday. Now, I mean, rather than the day after Saturday, meaning Sunday. Now, of course, in the modern era, I mean, you can find a number of different times where you start seeing, Rav Sadia Gaon was famous for this. He was fighting the Karaites, trying to explain how rabbinic interpretation and literal interpretation, rabbinic interpretation might be better than the literal interpretation that the Karaites were using. But again, when we get to the modern age, you have another wave of people trying to do things like that because there is an attempt to undercut traditional ways of reading the Torah. There's an attempt to undercut rabbinic tradition. So, two of the people who were very involved in this endeavor to try to justify, validate, prop up rabbinic tradition and rabbinic interpretation as against those who would want to undermine it based on saying, well, no, the literal meaning of the Torah obviously means X. Two of those people, one was Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, and another was Rav Tzvi Mecklenburg. It turns out that Rav David Tzvi Hoffman actually has a fairly long, really anthology of the different ways that people have explained how Mimachrat Shabbat really means the second day of Pesach, and then he gives his own interpretation. So I actually want to start with that because I think all of this is incredibly telling. It's both telling about what we think the word Shabbat means beyond just Saturday. It's telling about what we think Pesach is about, and ultimately it will also be telling in terms of what we think Shavuot is about. So let's check out Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, who's also going to quote Rav Mecklenburg. But he's also quoting Rishonim. He's also quoting medieval exegetes as well. Ibn Ezra Savur, right? Rav Avram Ibn Ezra, or Rav Avram Ben Ezra. Ibn Ezra thought, someone who is true, who is loyal to rabbinic tradition, can answer those who challenge. Maybe that first year of Pesach, after the law was given, actually Pesach fell out on a Shabbat. So therefore, ממחרת השבת could mean both Sunday and the second day of Pesach. באופן דומה, in a similar way, ניסה Rav Mecklenburg. Rav Mecklenburg in his Haktav HaKabbalah also tried להסביר את הביטוי ממחרת השבת, to explain ממחרת השבת, the day after Shabbat, מתוך הלוח של השנה הראשונה ליציאת מצרים. Right, based on the calendar that happened to be the year of Yetziat Mitzrayim, that happened to be that Shabbat was Pesach, and therefore ממחרת השבת was Sunday. But really, the point is, it's about being the second day of Pesach. But he also thinks sheyom rishon shel Chag HaPesach yachol hikareh b'shem Shabbat. You can also call the first day of Pesach, thinks Rav Mecklenburg, a Shabbat. Why? Mishum shebnei Yisrael sheyatzu miMitzrayim, because the Israelites who left Egypt hayu mechuyavim lehotzi et hachametz mibateim. They had to get the chametz out of their homes. Ma shenikra hashbatat se'or, that which is called destroying the leaven, right? Like you destroy the leaven from your house, you remove the leaven. So Shabbat here may not mean Shabbat as in Isur Melacha, don't do Melacha. It may not mean Shabbat as in Saturday. It may mean Shabbat as in destroying your leaven. Hirsch, Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch, Mishaer Kesher El Shabbat Haaretz. He actually thinks we should connect the word Shabbat in Mimachrat Shabbat to the resting of the land. Why? Because you weren't allowed to harvest new grains, right? What we know as Chadash, it's called, before the second day of Pesach. Haya oto yom Shabbat haaretz. You would call the first day of Pesach the Shabbat of the land. Now, Rav David Tzvi Hoffman doesn't love that interpretation, but suffice it to say, what we're starting to see here are the different ways that you can square the circle, right? One way to square the circle is to say, actually, Sunday on the second day of Pesach fell out the first time people had to actually do this. Another way to square the circle is to give different explanations for what Shabbat means. Maybe Shabbat means hashbatat sa'or, getting rid of your leaven. Maybe Shabbat means Shabbat haaretz, not yet harvesting. And the Ramban has another creative explanation for what Shabbat might mean. HaRamban omer she'et Shabbat b'pasuk Yud Aleph, the explanation of Shabbat, efshar lefarish gam b'muvan shavua. You can understand Shabbat meaning week, right? We say Sheva Shabbatot Tmimot Tiana, 7 full weeks. Klomar, meaning Hakatuv mitzaveh lirot et yom hanafat ha-omer. The Torah commands us to see the day of the waving of the Omer offering, ki yom rishon shel shavua. It's the beginning of a week because we're going to start sefirat ha-omer. So it's going to be the beginning of the first week of sefirat ha-omer. Ume'az lispor shiva shavot, and from there to count 7 weeks. Lefi zeh nikra yom ha-omer ממחרת השבת. Therefore, we're going to call the day of the Omer, right? The day of the offering of the Omer, barley offering. We're going to call that ממחרת השבת, meaning haynu yom rishon l'shavua echad. It's the first day of the first week of counting the Omer, right? It's a way of saying the day after Shabbat means it's the first day of the next week. So it's just trying to tell us this is the first day of sefirat ha-omer, the first week of sefirat ha-omer, right? Moses Mendelssohn, important Enlightenment Jewish thinker, religious thinker, she'af echad mibein kol habe'erim einam menichim et da'ato. He was not comfortable with any of the explanations. Mitametz lehochiach. He tries to prove shepirusham shel hakaraim. He says, well, the Karaites nitkal gam hem bekoshim chazakim keila. Their explanation also has very difficult challenges. Trying to say it's Sunday also has very difficult challenges. And he basically, has sort of like a weak comfort. He says, he says, you know what, better to read the pasuk in a less challenging way, which is Chazal's way, than a more challenging way, because the more challenging way doesn't, I'll give you some examples. It doesn't actually, there's no date for Shavuot. If you do that right there, if it's just Sunday, like the first Sunday after the harvest, there's no actual date for Shavuot on the calendar. Okay, so bottom line is, these are a bunch of explanations that came before Rav David Tzvi Hoffman. He's not so satisfied with any of them, so he offers his own. Namely, he wants to understand what it means to call a Yom Tov Shabbat, and to understand that Yamim Tovim, that holidays, have actually 2 major dimensions. One is the dimension of Isur Melacha, the prohibition to do labor, which is very similar to Shabbat, of course, with the exception of being able to prepare food that you're going to eat on that day. The other is everyone getting together and, kind of being joyous before God and coming together as a community, which is what he's going to call Chag. So let's take a look. He says, well, yesh lanu lahaniach b'ikvot chachamenu. He says, I think in the footsteps of our sages, we can say shehatzivui Shabbaton b'moadim, when holidays like Rosh Hashanah are called Shabbaton, sheba b'pam harishona b'Rosh Hashanah, that comes the first time when we're talking about Rosh Hashanah, boneh binyan av l'chol hachagim b'lo yotzei min haklal. That actually applies to all holidays. All holidays have a dimension of Shabbaton. Okay, I'm skipping a little bit. And he says, I'm just moving this out of my way. Okay. There's no question that regarding any holiday where there is a rest from work, right? Shabbat, Shvita. They are, in the matter of the spirit of the law, they have a Shabbat dimension. Lefichach nikret Shabbat ha-shavua b'fi chachamenu Shabbat Bereshit. That's why the rabbis even had to come up with a phrase that referred to Saturdays, namely Shabbat Bereshit, right? Uvazeh hi nivdelet mishar hachagim, which differentiates it from the other Shabbatot, which are the Shabbatot of the Yamim Tovim, right? I'm going to give some examples. I'm skipping a little bit more. Imzeh ein hayamim tovim hatovim nikraim al pi rov Shabbat. It's true. The holidays are not majority of the time called Shabbat. Ela Chag or Moed. Instead, they're called Chag. They're called, festival, or they're called Moed, like meeting. Bituyim shemagdirim et hayamim ha'ele. These are terms that define these days. Lo lefi hatziyun ha'ofyani shel shvitat melacha. They define these days not as the key characteristic being not doing labor. Ela lefi hatziyun ha'ofyani shel hitkahalut am b'makom echad. Right? It actually is pushing us to think about the characteristic of the nation getting together in one place. V'yitatzmut hasimcha lifnei Hashem, and the strengthening of joy before God. Right? So the holidays have 2 parts to them. And in fact, it basically says, of course, you have Chol HaMoed. Chol HaMoed is not going to be called Shabbat. Of course, it's not going to be called Shabbat, right? So you can call things Chag, you can call things Moed, but when you want to emphasize the Shvitat Melacha, the fact that you're resting from work, you're going to call it Shabbat or you're going to call it Shabbaton. And so he says, ולכן לא היה בנמצא שם מתאים יותר לציון היום ה-16 בניסן מאשר ממחרת השבת. He says, therefore, with this understanding, there is no more appropriate term for the 16th of Nisan than the day after Shabbat. Why? Not because it's Sunday, but because Harei HaChag od lo nistayim. The holiday of Pesach, the Chag of Pesach, of course, hasn't ended. Ach ha-Shabbat shel ha-Chag, but the Shabbat part, because remember, one day of Yom Tov in Israel, right? The Shabbat, the Isur Melacha part of the holiday, kvar avar, that's already gone. Umatchil cholo shel ha-Chag, o shel ha-Moed. And now the mundane days of the holiday, or the Moed of the, either way, holiday is what we're trying to say, have started, right? Interesting. And then he says, "Ve'ein makom lit'ot," I don't want you to think, make a mistake. Ki'ilu ha-Shabbat lo haya mitkaben liyom harishon shel Chag el yom hacharon. You could say, oh, well, maybe Memacheret Shabbat means the day after the seventh day of Pesach. That's also a Yom Tov, right? She'arei hayom hacharon, he says, no. The last day of Pesach, Mesayem et HaChag, ends the whole holiday, including both the times that have no melacha is allowed, and the times that are chol hamoed. So therefore, v'hayom macharat shalo, if it was the day after the last day of Pesach, then nikra b'vadai karagil macharat hachag. It would have been called after the chag, right? Because there is no more chag left, so you wouldn't just call it mimacharat Shabbat. V'rak yom tetzayin b'Nisan kar'u kifi she'efshar l'she'er macharat Shabbat. And therefore, it's only the 16th of Nisan, which is called the day after the resting from melacha, okay? And he says, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. Okay. Says, over here, ומתקבל על הדעת, כי הכינוי מחרת השבת נבחר גם מטעמים מסוימים אחרים. Says, there's also other reasons to call this time ממחרת השבת, לסמן את יום 16 בניסן, to talk about 16th of Nisan. Why? ביום זה היה צריך להתחיל ספירת 7 שבועות, you start the 7 weeks of counting sefirat ha-omer at that time, שהם מקבילים אל 7 שבתות השנים לפני היובל. Those are parallel to the 7 years of 7 that we do before we have a jubilee year. כפי שהסברנו לעיל, like we've explained before. שנים אלו, these years, when you think about the jubilee, when you think about 7 years of 7, right? 7 years, 7 cycles of Shemitah. Shanim elu mukafot shtei shenot yovel. Those 49 years, the 49-year cycle before you have a yovel, is actually surrounded on both sides by a yovel. The year before the 49-year cycle begins was a yovel, and the year after the 49-year cycle ends is a yovel. Achat mizeh v'achat mizeh on each side. V'kach yu mukafim gam yemei shiva shavuot, shnei yamim mitzuyanim. And likewise, the 49 days of sefirat ha-omer should also be surrounded on both sides by a special day. Pesach, before you start the 7 weeks of 7, and Shavuot, after you finish, right? So the point is, they each give, and he continues and says, they each give a ruach kedusha. And therefore, there's something important about the fact that the 7 weeks of 7 has a special day beforehand and a special day afterwards, similar to how you have a Yovel year, a Jubilee year, special day before, special year before you start the 49-year cycle, and a special year after, and all of them are actually characterized by a certain degree of Shabbat, of Menucha. Either the land lies fallow, or you're not doing melacha, right? So he's looking at it as a whole way of thinking about what it means to have bookends of Shabbat, not literally Saturday, but a time of rest on both sides of both the 49-year cycle of the Shemitahs and the 49-day cycle of counting between Pesach and Shavuot. Now, I think this is rather beautiful because I do think that it's important to recognize how is Yom Tov different from Shabbat. Well, Shabbat, basically the Isur Melacha aspect is the key aspect of Shabbat. Yom Tov, the idea was, I mean, think about the pilgrimage aspect of it, right? Yom Tov, actually, the idea was being communal, right? And it also has times, holidays, I always, as a kid, I would always say, well, okay, so which part of Pesach are we not allowed to watch TV? And which part of Pesach are we allowed to watch TV, right? Having a Chag that isn't just about Isur Melacha means that there's something else that the Chag is about in addition, right? So I think being able to differentiate these two aspects that come within Yom Tov and within Chagim, the Isur Melacha aspect that imitates Shabbat, and the Hitkahalut Ha'am, the people getting together, which applies whether you have labor, prohibition of labor or not, is really significant and really interesting, let alone the fact that he's making a comparison between the idea that you should have the 49 days bookended on both sides by a day of rest, just like you have the 49-year cycle bookended on both sides by a jubilee, by a year of rest. So far, what we've seen are people reinterpreting the word Shabbat in lots of different ways. And what we see Rav Tzvi Hoffman doing is saying Shabbat is actually a dimension of Yom Tov. Now, Dr. David Henschke, who is a contemporary academic, whose work I really, really love, he goes in a different direction. He's not actually interested necessarily in saying that Shabbat equals Yom Tov, but excuse me, he is actually, I mean, he still comes to the same conclusion that we're talking about the 16th of Nisan, but he goes back to this idea of Shabbat as completion, right? A little bit, the Ramban was saying that a little bit, maybe, right? Shabbat as completion, thinking about Sheshet Yimei Breshit, right? You have the 6 days of Breshit, and Shabbat means God is done. Shabbat means completion, and therefore, Mimacheret HaShabbat means after something's been completed. Okay, so let's take a look at what he has to say. It says, Mahi efo mashma'uto shel ha'mechaneh ha'meshutav l'shnei ha'moadim. What do, starting with everybody's got to notice that there are 49 days of sefirat ha-omer, and there are 49 years of the Shemitah cycle. What do they have in common? Davar ze yesh lilmod min hamatkonet hamisparit hameshutefet lahem. Well, they certainly share a numerology, right? Shekein shnat ha-chamishim o yom ha-chamishim ba'im lachar sheva Shabbatot. The 50th year, Yovel, or the 50th day, Shavuot, comes after 7 weeks or 7 cycles, right? 7 years of 7 or 7 days of 7. HaShabbat, the Sabbath, Shabbat Breshit, whether we're talking about usually the Shabbat of creation or Shabbat Haaretz or the Shemitah year, right? Letting the land lie fallow. Mitzayanet et hasiyum. It tells us about completion. It marks completion. Shisha yamim v'shesh shanim oseh adam b'Yisrael et ma'asav. For 6 days of the week, for 6 years of the Shemitah cycle, a Jew does what they're supposed to do. They do their actions, their activities, their labor, uvahagia Shabbat kalu kol masav. And when Shabbat comes, whether it's Saturday or it's Shemitah year, you don't do anymore. V'arehu shovet b'menucha. They have to rest. They have to rest. So Sheva, 7, mashma'o efo gemar. It means gemar siyum v'hashlama. It means completion. That's what 7 is. Sheva pamim Sheva, 7 times 7, eno efo ela siyum shalem. It's like a complete completion. Gemar muchalat, an absolute completion. Ma'u efo mashma'o shel chamishim. So what's the 50th? Hamatzoi me'aver l'siyum. That comes after the finishing. ha-omer, ha-hitchadshut. Renewal, ha'hatchala hachadasha mibreshit, the new beginning from the beginning, from Breshit. Zeu efo mashma'o shel hayovel. This is the meaning of the Jubilee. After a full cycle of the life of a society, 7 years of 7 that have completed, you start again from the beginning. Tkiyat hashofar shel Yom Kippurim, blowing the shofar on Yom Kippur in the Jubilee year, machzirat ha'chevra lematzava rishoni, returns the society back to its original state. Kol adam chozer nachlato, people return to their original plots of land. Shav lemishpachto, they go back to their families. Poter mechadash b'chayei dror kvi tivam mekori, they go back to their natural state of being a free person. Zohi efo hitchadshut chevratit, so it represents the renewal, the societal renewal. Leumat zot, on the other hand, mitzayen yom habikurim, the day of Bikurim, which is how Shavuot is known, represents et hitchadshut hateva, the renewal of nature. V'yikraftem mincha chadasha laHashem imoshvotechem taviu lechem tnufa. Shtayim, shnei asronim sola tiena chametz teafena bikurim laHashem. Right? You are going to bring a new mincha, a new offering to God, the shtei halechem, and they're going to come from where you live, and they're going to be chametz, and this is a new offering, right? Renewal, renewal, renewal. This is bikurim, the first of the grains. Lachar siyum machzor tivi shel shana shlema, after the end of a natural cycle of a full year, yesh biyadeinu shuv bikurim hateva mitchadesh, right? We have new grains. Nature is renewing itself. V'hareinu makrivim mimenu laHashem mincha chadasha, and from it we offer to God a new offering. Therefore, the holiday is called the Yom HaBikurim. And so what basically he tries to do is he tries to show that the reason why the ha-omer is cut ממחרת השבת, it means it's at the end of all the work you did before being able to harvest. That ended yesterday on the first day of Pesach. Then, second day of Pesach is a renewal. You're going to harvest the new grain. And then after a count of 49 days, you have the renewal of, you're gonna give korbanot of the new, before it was barley and now it's going to be of the new wheat. It's hitchadshut. So ממחרת Shabbat is the day after all of your work is finished. Shabbat represents completion. Now we're into hitchadshut, renewal. He does more. He gives Shmini Atzeret as its own example. I put in the sources. I definitely think people should take a look. He makes distinctions between the way that Shavuot is presented in Sefer Vayikra on the one hand, and the way that Shavuot is presented in Sifrei Shmot and Dvarim on the other. It's absolutely fascinating. The question of whether you're celebrating Siyum, the ending, or whether you're celebrating Hitchadshut, the beginning. But it's absolutely beautiful that what he's bringing to the conversation here is that these are holidays of, for us, we think about it, it's like the spring. We always think new beginnings in the spring. That's the point, right? Like new beginnings. It's not snowing anymore. It's not raining anymore. It's not new beginnings. And that's exactly what he thinks ממחרת Shabbat suggests. It's after the siyum. A new beginning only begins after a completion of something else. So it's appreciating the completion and being excited to inaugurate the new beginning. I have one more explanation for ממחרת Shabbat that is not going to tell us about Shabbat as a dimension of Yom Tov, is not going to tell us as Shabbat as a representation of siyum, of completion. And so ממחרת Shabbat is something that is hitchadshut, that is renewal. I'm going to tell you something that is from an Akkadian term. Professor Michael Fishbane points out that actually, he says, the obvious question must now be posed: why would a term indicating the Sabbath day be applied to a mid-month festival, right? Something that is a 7, why do you think it would represent a 15, right? Why would you use the word Shabbat, which, by the way, 15 isn't even a multiple of 7, right? Why would you use Shabbat to refer to the 15th of the month? ממחרת Shabbat, the day after the 15th of the month. So he says all these problems are resolved once it is realized that the term Shabbat, used in Vayikra 23, actually preserves an ancient and precise terminology. The issue takes an entirely new turn in light of evidence, ready, that the Akkadian term shapatu was used as a technical term for the full moon at mid-month, meaning it is possible that the Torah is actually, the pshat is actually ממחרת Shabbat, the day after shapatu, meaning the day after the 15th of the month, and that it is that simple. Now, it's interesting to note that when you look in Vayikra 23, and I definitely, recommend, especially preparing for Pesach, and just thinking about Chagim season, if people want to look back at Vayikra 23, it is true that the word Shabbat is used in many different kinds of ways in that little section in the Torah, right? It's used to mean a week. It's used to mean a time of rest. It's used to mean Saturday. It's right. And so Shapatu might be another way that it is actually used. And those kinds of things I just absolutely love, because it tells you something about being able to understand the context in which the Torah was given helps, it just adds a layer of what the meaning was. So I hope everybody enjoyed. And when you start counting Omer, ממחרת השבת, the day after the first day of Pesach, in a few weeks from now, God willing, I hope you think of this, and I hope it augments your understanding of Pesach as something that has a dimension of both Shabbat and all holidays, of both Shabbat and Hitka'alut Ha'am. I hope it enhances your understanding of Pesach as something that is a renewal after the siyum, after the ending of the earlier part of the year, and likewise Shavuot is a renewal, certainly in the Beit HaMikdash, of uh, being able to give the wheat offerings and representing an appreciation of the siyum, but an excitement about the renewal, an excitement about the bikurim, and by the way, not just grains, but ultimately first fruits as well, right? We start being able to bring bikurim then, and also just to recognize that there might be some subtle understandings within the Torah that if you understand the ancient Near East, the subtlety is just right there in front of you, and it doesn't have to be so subtle. Thanks, everyone.